Hello, and a warm welcome to the City Business School students to today's webinar. My name is Deborah Labbate. I'm based in the UK and I run my own consultancy. I've been in business for a number of years, having previously owned and operated a car rental business, petrol filling stations, and a car body repair business. These days, in my consultancy work, I work in the SME space, generally with business owners, on a mixture of things like operations, efficiencies, time management, people management, generally all the areas that general business needs to cover. And that also incorporates marketing and people's branding and people presenting themselves. And it's about presentations that I'm going to be talking to you today. Now, I wasn't always a confident speaker. This is something that I've had to learn more about and practice a lot. And it's something that you can do too. And today I'm going to be sharing with you some ideas around that and giving you a model to work to, which might help you in your presentations. An interesting point before we start, and death came third. There's some slides attached to this presentation, which you can follow now or you can pick up with later. And Death Came Third is a piece of research that was done by the New York Times some years ago. And that actually showed that death came third because what came before that, people were more fearful of walking into a crowded room with people that they didn't know and actually speaking in public, which is really quite remarkable. You'd think that death would be way more frightening, wouldn't you? But a lot of people would actually rather be in the box than reading the eulogy. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll pick up some tips and take away a few pointers that are going to help you in your own presentations. So what am I going to be sharing with you today? In this webinar, I'm going to take you through some basic steps to enable you to become more confident when you have to present. Now, this might be presenting to one person or it might be presenting to many. I'm just keeping an eye in the chat box for any questions that are coming through, and we seem to be fine with that at the moment. So yes, I'm going to be sharing with you some tips to help you with your confidence, and I'm going to give you a model to work to, which will help you when you're actually formatting your presentations and give you a bit of an insight into storyboarding. And also I'm going to touch on learning and presentation styles. So we've got quite a bit to get through in the next hour. So I will crack on with that. Now, one of the things I want to talk to you about in the first place is fear and the root cause of fear. And this is about how our brains are wired, what fear actually is to us, and about reframing. Now, fear, if you take that as F-E-A-R, fear really is just false evidence appearing real. We're very often fearful of things that actually don't happen, and we can get ourselves into a bit of a loop and a bit of a state about this. So when it comes to actually presenting and to selling ourselves, whether it's ourselves personally or our products or our services, then this really depends on our abilities to stand up and be heard. And what often prevents us from telling our story successfully is not our inability to articulate what we do or how strongly we believe in the value of what we offer. Instead, it is simply the fear of speaking in front of an audience, whether that's one or whether that's many. For some people, it's a large audience that's more frightening. But for a lot of people, it could just be having to present in an interview, maybe just to 1, 2, or 3 people. So it's really important that we master this skill. Being nervous while presenting can really put a dent in your credibility and have an adverse effect on what you're trying to achieve in your business or your career goals and aspirations. So again, it's really important that we actually master this. So to manage the fear of speaking in public, you first need to understand the root cause of the fear. And one of the best explanations that I've come across for this is from a guy called Scott Birkin. And he wrote a book, I think it was called Confessions of a Public Speaker. Anyway, in this book, just sort of paraphrase, one of the things that he's saying is the design of the brain's wiring, giving its long operational history, hundreds of thousands of years older than the history of public speaking, makes it impossible to stop fearing what it knows is the worst tactical position for one person to be in. Birkin actually says the worst tactical position is standing alone in an open space with no place to hide, without a weapon, facing a large group of creatures staring at you. As Birkin put it, being in this situation meant the odds were high that you would soon be attacked or eaten alive. Well, our ancestors, the ones who survived at least, developed a fear response to these situations. Now, understanding that our brains can't tell the difference between a real threat, a pack of wolves about to attack you, for example, like in the previous example, and an imagined threat, a group of your peers watching you present, well, they're certainly not going to eat you alive. And actually, an awful lot of people in the audience will be so pleased that it's you presenting and not them. And that's where this false evidence appearing real comes in, the FEAR that I referred to at the start. So this awareness can help you manage the false alarm that happens in the absence of actual real danger. So how so? As you feel your heart racing and you start your presentation, can you consciously and deliberately interrupt that fear response with a quick deep breath and a rational thought? This is just a false alarm. If you keep telling yourself that, you can start to overcome it. And the more you get into the habit of interrupting the fear response as soon as you feel it happening, then the more practiced and the more honed you will get at that. And the quicker you'll learn to prevent it from being your default response in the first instance, whenever you present in front of a group. So that's something really to sort of bear in mind and actually pay attention to how you're actually feeling and what's actually going on and whether it's real or whether it's not. So you've got to ingrain that in your mind and change the pattern of your thinking. So if you can reframe the questions that you ask yourself, when you worry before a high stakes presentation, for example, you may have a tendency to ask yourself negative questions like, what will happen if I forget my material? What will happen if this? What will happen if that? And that sort of negative self-talk can become quite debilitating, really. And all it does is heighten your anxiety. So if you can replace those negative questions with a positive one, like, what would happen if I absolutely rock this presentation? Ask yourself good questions, give it a try, and it will calm the noise in your head. And the other thing to do is practice as if you're the worst. If you know your material really, really well, there's a tendency to get sloppy when you're actually practicing a speech. So if you've really scanned through your information, you sort of know it, but not thoroughly, then it's much better to have really practiced it very well. Lots of things can take you off your guard. I've done a few of these webinars now, and we've had problems on and off with the technology, and that then unsettles me. So what we've done is more practice with the technology, just short bursts of it. So we've got the technology right, and therefore I feel far more confident using that technology. What else? If you practice out loud and actually visualize your audience, and if you can find out where you're going to be speaking and maybe the layout of the room, etc., that will give you more confidence also. And if you can memorize the sequence of your slides so you know what's coming up next, that'll also give you more confidence. And you might want to create some backup slides if you're using slides at all, and sometimes speaking without them is way better. If you've got some slides that might cover some of the questions that you might get asked, so you're prepared again. So if you can preempt some of the questions that you might get asked, that will also help you with your confidence. And also visualization. Visualization is really, really powerful. It's like a mental rehearsal tool. So if you actually visualize yourself in the space where you're going to be speaking, or in the interview situation, or in the pitch, whatever the situation is for you when you're doing this presentation, if you can visualize all the elements of that, again, that will give you way more confidence. And also stop seeing your presentation as a performance. Instead, treat every presentation like a series of person-to-person conversations. You really just imagine talking to one person in the room. That can make things a lot easier for you as well. And the more you remind yourself of this, the more you can shift your focus away from that sort of fear-induced thought pattern that you may have had previously. Taking some deep breaths before you start and even during your presentation is really helpful. And also concentrate on the speed of your voice. Now, I'm really going to slow my speaking down now. I naturally speak really rather quickly. Speaking as slowly as I'm speaking now feels really alien to me, and it's probably a little too slow, but I'm actually trying to demonstrate a point. So if we just speed up a little bit, but not massively, then it's probably easier for the audience to understand. And whilst it might sound in our own heads like we're speaking really slowly, actually slowing it down is probably helping the audience to take in the words that you're using and therefore take more from your presentation. So you need to practice with that and find sort of a comfortable pace. Much easier when you're actually facing an audience. For me right now, I'm just talking to myself on a screen. You're listening on the other side. I know you're there, but I can't see you. If I could actually see you, I would be taking my gaze across the room perhaps, so that everybody was having some eye contact with me at some point during my presentation. That makes it much better for the audience. They feel like they're really being talked to. Much more difficult, as I say, when you're hiding behind a screen. And the other thing to try is to have a bit of a power pose. Your body language can help you feel so much better. If you're sitting up straight, if you're sitting down to speak, or if you're standing up, sort of feet hip width apart, relaxed, slightly softened knees, a very solid stance, but also relaxed so that you're approachable in what you're delivering. And pause frequently. Give the audience a moment to catch up with what you're talking about. And the other thing when you're actually looking at an audience is to come to terms with the audience's expressions. Your anxiety level is increased when you misinterpret the audience's facial expressions. In normal conversations, we're accustomed to getting feedback sort of along the way, a nod or a smile or some kind of sign of approval from the one person that we're talking to. That's a little bit more difficult when you're looking at a whole audience. They may be giving you a bit of a blank stare, which doesn't mean they don't like what they hear. More often than not, it simply means that they're concentrating on your message. And this is especially true of audience members who are introverted. There's a Japanese proverb that says, fear is only as deep as the mind allows. So put your mind on developing your key company message or your personal branding message and crafting your story. Replace the time expended on worrying with the time spent on preparing, so you're thoroughly prepared for your presentation. Knowing your material, absolutely, practicing it beyond the point of pain, then go out there and absolutely win them over. So that sort of touched on the root cause of fear and how you can reframe some of that. Now, anyone can talk. We do it all the time. We talk to colleagues, we talk to family members, we talk to people when we're purchasing things in shops or restaurants or wherever. We're talking all the time. But when we get into that kind of conversation, particularly if you're just chatting with friends or colleagues, we can go off the tangent, we can get interrupted. We can end up talking about the thing that we weren't going to talk about, or we go off at such a tangent that we lose the point of what we're trying to say. Now, that's very, very different when you're doing a presentation. When you're doing a presentation, you need to be absolutely clear about your path and your final destination. And as I've said before, you really need to know your stuff. So you're not going to get the distractions that you get when you're in a conversation, but you need to keep yourself focused on your end game and be really clear on what the points are that you want to get over. Now, I want to take a little bit of a look now at the structure of your presentations and learning styles. And some of you may be familiar with Kolb's learning styles, and you'll pick up on one of the slides a bit of a diagram for this. And it takes people on a continuum. And some people will learn by experience, some people will learn by reflecting, some people will learn by thinking, and some people will learn by doing. And some of us will do elements of that. So we're each individuals and we'll approach it from a slightly different way. But when you're delivering it to an audience, it's not so much about you, it's about them, their interpretation and what they're going to take from your presentation and whether they're going to actually get your key message. So it's really important that you take into account different people's learning styles when you're going to do a presentation of any description. So if I can just go into that a little bit deeper, it's important that you can adapt. If you don't know who your audience is, that's more difficult. So you might need to incorporate everybody's learning styles when you don't know. If you do know, then maybe you can tweak it a little bit more. There's a a guy called Bernice McCarthy, who took a lot of this information and came up with something called the format system, which I'm going to take you through in a moment. And it's one of the most widely used systems that I certainly know of in learning and teaching today. And it simplifies those learning styles into a practical system that's easier to understand and easier for you to structure your presentations around. So we're going to be having a look at that in a little bit more depth. So if you're able to actually look at the slides at the moment, that will probably be helpful for you in following this. But essentially, what the format system does, it helps you take people through what the topic is about, and then you're going to tell them why you're discussing it and why it's relevant and the reasons. And you're going to give them a detailed what, so you're going to give them quite a lot of information. And you'll do an exercise with them on the how, so that they can actually experience it. And you're also going to discuss the what if, and that gives them a chance to ask questions. So what questions do you have? What do you find out? What do you want to tell me? So if you go through this and then accommodate all those different learning styles, which I'm going to go through with you. So you'll see in the slide, I'm just going to pick up my notes here so that I can keep myself on track. So if you've got that format slide saying that it's headlined with people learn in different ways. Okay, so we're going to start with the why, or the why not. This is the diverger. So what does the diverger need? They need to know why before they can begin anything. They need personal meaning and motivation. So leaders need to give them a reason. Oops, sorry. Got a question coming through here. How can we stop being afraid in public? Okay, shall I come back to the questions at the end? I think that might be easier. So I'll pick those up. Thank you for that question. So the why and the why not. So this person needs to know why before they can begin anything. And if you've just got on with everything and you haven't satisfied that why, you're probably going to lose them. So these people prefer to consider a situation from different perspectives, like brainstorming sessions, generating more ideas, coming up with alternatives and possibilities. They like to work in groups and to gather information. They listen with an open mind and they get personalized feedback. Their views are concrete. Their views of concrete situations may differ from other people's points of view. They observe rather than take action. They integrate their experiences with themselves. They want commitment. They exercise authority with participation and trust. That they like to work towards harmony, and they perceive information concretely and process it very reflectively. Their favorite question is why. So the next one in this is the assimilator. So what does the assimilator need? They're asking the what questions. They need facts in order to get a conceptual understanding. They're interested in what you know and what you want them to know. Leaders need to give them lots of information and facts to deepen their understanding. They want to achieve goals and personal effectiveness. They learn through thinking through their ideas. They need that detail. They really do need that detail. They're more interested in abstract ideas and concepts than in people. And they are thorough and they're industrious. They'll re-examine facts if situations are confusing. And they quite enjoy traditional classrooms and schools, lectures, reading, and analytical models, that sort of thing. So what is the question that they're always trying to get answered? Many of us will fall into a mixture of these categories. We're not necessarily just sitting in one. So the next one is the converger. This is the person who's constantly asking the how question. They need to know how things work. They're best at finding practical uses for ideas and theories. And leaders need to let them try it out. You know, they really need to understand that how it works. They need to do it. They need hands-on activity. They like to experiment with new ideas, situations, practical applications, laboratory work, that sort of thing. They seek usability, utility, solvency and results. They test theories in the most sensible ways, and they use factual data to build designed concepts. They have limited tolerance to fuzzy ideas, and they need to know what will help them in life. And they're decision makers once they've understood that how. So they're very good in careers like applied sciences and engineering, that sort of thing. So that's what a converger, the how person, looks like. And lastly, we've got the accommodator. Now, these are the what if people. They're interested in finding out if they can create new possibilities. They need to know what would happen if. Leaders need to let them teach it and apply it to themselves and others, and work with others, set goals, test different approaches, and then apply it to life situations. They learn primarily from hands-on experience, and they enjoy carrying out plans, and they enjoy new and challenging experiences. They can tend to act on their gut feelings rather than on logical analysis, and many people they may rely on more information for their own technical analysis. They seek hidden possibilities and excitement. You know, what if we could do that? What if we could do that? I'm sure you've met these people. And they're adaptable to change. In fact, they absolutely relish change. They like variety and flexibility. They tend to take risks, and they're at ease with people. They often reach accurate conclusions without logical justification. So these are your what if people. And in careers, they're happy with marketing, sales, action orientated managerial jobs, education and social professions. I think I'm a what if person. So that's sort of taking you through that format. So you've got your why and your why not. You've got your what about it? You've got the how does it work? And you've got your what ifs. Now, if in the early part of your presentation, you can touch on all of those points, and then you can go back to them in more detail, you'll capture everybody in your audience because you will have touched on all their different learning styles. And this will help you to deliver a much more structured, a much more easy to understand for the audience type of presentation. Let me just turn my volume off because I'm getting some noise coming through there. Okay, right. So that's taken you through the format system. Now, planning is really important when you're going to do any kind of presentation. So there's two checklists for this. I can actually pass these on. They're not totally in the slides. I can maybe we could maybe get a document attached to this presentation so that you can actually go through those checklists in a bit more detail. So the preliminary checklist, the questions that you need to be asking yourself is, what is your outcome? You know, what do you actually want to achieve from your presentation? What will be your evidence procedure to know that it's been a success? So how will you know that you've actually achieved your outcome? And what do you want people to leave your presentation with? Is it a feeling? Is it information? Is it a task to go and do? And what's their outcome? How will they know when they will have it? What's their evidence procedure? So if I was delivering this topic in a live situation where I was actually in the room with you and I was interacting with you, what I may well do at the start is I would maybe have a flip chart and I would be asking people in the audience, what do you want to leave here with today? And I would be noting those things on my flip chart. And at the end, I'd go back to it while the audience is still present and just make sure that we've ticked all those things off, that we have actually met all the criteria that people set in the first place. What else? Who's attending? How many people are attending? Do they know each other? How well do they know each other, if they know each other at all? What are their ages? What are their demographics? What are their personal and professional backgrounds? What you're wanting to do here by asking these questions is build up a picture of your audience so that you can tailor your presentation to that audience. What attitudes might be expected? What are the values of these people? What are their social and political orientations, etc.? And what specific needs do they have? Do they have to be there? Or have they been sent? Have they got an investment in being there, or is someone else paying them to be there? I think you get a very different experience with your audience if it's an audience who actually want to be in the room. So what are the expectations? How familiar are they already with the subject matter? What's the presentation environment going to be like? If you can go and look at it, it'll be much easier for you to visualize when you're practicing your presentation in the first place. And how long does this presentation need to be, and what time of day will it take place, and does that have any bearing on what you're going to deliver, and where you're going to deliver it, and how you're going to deliver it? So that's your preliminary checklist before you even started actually putting your presentation together. And then we get into the logistics of your presentation. So there's various stages for this. So you've got before the presentation. So you've got to choose and sign a contract with the seminar location, possibly, or whoever the stakeholder is in this presentation. The location may need, if you're paying to put on an event, you've got to sort out all your pricing so that you're charging enough for your event. If you're in a internal situation where you're presenting to a board or something, that would be slightly different. But it's really knowing your audience and knowing all the parameters that sit around that. What materials are you going to need for this presentation? Do you need handouts? Do you need presentation manuals? They take a lot of time to put together. You may need multiple people to be helping you with that. You'll certainly want somebody to proofread it before you're having manuals printed. Are you going to need any help when you're doing this presentation? So if you're going to need assistance from different people, what are their actual roles going to be in the environment of your presentation? You'll want some feedback at the end, so you'll need feedback and release forms. You may need flyers and brochures. You might need materials, like a flip chart. You may want to make provision for people to have breaks during your presentation. So what does that look like? So there's quite a lot of things to think about. If you're going to be standing on a stage, are you going to be provided with a lectern, or do you need to bring your own? Music stands are very useful because they're usually quite portable. I use one of those all the time. You maybe need a list of delegates. Are you going to have to sign people in? Do you need name badges? And do you need to dress the room in any way? This is more for when you're doing some kind of public presentation, as opposed to being in an interview situation or an internal meeting where you've got to do a presentation on the progress of your department, for example. Okay, so on the day of the actual presentation, again, this is if you're inviting people in, or you're going to have a very large audience, you're going to need a registration time, a registration desk, a list of people that are coming so that you can tick them off, or maybe you can do this with an electronic device, which is becoming much more popular. Are you providing name badges for people, or some kind of holder where they can slot their business cards in and you can use those as name badges? You need to check all the room logistics, check all the doors, the location of the lighting, the temperature control for the room. You need to know where the restrooms are. Are there going to be any fire alarms? This sort of thing. There's quite a lot when you're doing some kind of public presentation to take into account. So it's quite likely you will need some help with this. If you're walking into an interview situation where you're going to do a presentation, then all those things are taken care of for you. All you're now going to be doing is presenting you and taking control of you. So that is a slightly different situation. And again, going back to some kind of public presentation at the end of the day, you may want to have feedback forms and collect that information in, and you can learn. So each time you do one of these, you can get better and you can improve. going back to an interview situation, again, you'll want feedback on how you performed so that you can improve as time goes on. So that's some information there on the sort of preliminary questions and all the things you need to think about around doing any kind of presentation that's public, and a few thoughts on what you might do on an internal presentation or an interview situation. So going back to how you structure your presentation, whether this is for a public event or whether this is just for an internal presentation, is to go through a storyboarding practice or a technique. So when you start to create your presentation, this storyboarding method will keep the whole presentation in perspective. So while you're working it out and you're chunking and sequencing, you can keep sight of your end goal all the time. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there's 6 sections to this storyboarding exercise. So the first one is the brainstorming. So anything goes here. There's no judgment, there's no evaluations. You can be outrageous, you can be wild, you can be childlike with it and have some fun. You can be creative and spontaneous, and you can play with ideas and variations on the theme. And you're going for quantity at this point. So you're getting all your ideas out onto the table or onto a piece of paper, as it were, before you actually start to put full structure around your presentation. Having done that, then you need to organize. So post-it notes are absolutely brilliant for that. So you can organize all those bits of information into different categories. You can spend a reasonable amount of time over this, but don't sort of get too hung up on this stage. And then once you've got that into some kind of order, you'll probably have different categories that all those ideas fit into. And then next you come to sequencing. So here you've got to keep your outcome in mind. You've got to decide what comes first and what comes second, third, fourth, and so on. And what must come before what in that sequence. So there could be an order to each part. So you've got an overall sequence, and you may have a sequence within the sequence. So you're breaking it down so you can actually plan out the whole of the presentation. This is really useful when you're actually trying to do something to an amount of time. So, if you've got an hour, you can decide how much time you need in each section and each sequence. Now, once you've done this, so you've created your storyboard, you've gone through that brainstorming process, you've gone through the organizing process, and then you've gone through the sequencing process, and now you need to refine it. So you need to really make sure at this point that your outcomes are met. And then we need to contextualize it, determine the flow of the presentation and the look of the content. So just go back to the beginning and work your way through it. Is it actually making sense? Does it flow? Do you need to change the order and sequence at this point? And having done that, then you've got to test for time. So determine how long the outline for this presentation will take. Notice whether you have more material than you do time. This is something that I have got wrong frequently. I've had an hour's presentation and I've probably had 2 hours worth of content. So you find yourself rushing through bits of it or taking out some real key important points. So it's very important to go through this process and actually test this out. And then you can decide what's important, what's not, what to prioritize and what to cut. And you always need to leave room at the end for handling questions, discussions, and any lack of understanding that might come out that needs further explanation. So that's your storyboarding. So what have we covered overall in this presentation so far? And it's important to do this periodically to actually recap, to make sure that you've still got people keeping up with you and knowing what you've covered. If it's a very long presentation, people can start to forget what happened at the beginning. So it's a bit of a reminder, a bit of a refresh, and it can help you to actually join all the different parts of the presentation up. So what have we covered so far? Well, obviously at the beginning, I gave you a bit of an introduction to myself, and then we talked about fear. And people can be very fearful of doing a presentation of any sort. And we talked about how you might overcome that. And then we've talked about models for learning. So we've talked about the different learning styles and the people who want to know the what, the how, the why, and the what if. So we've talked about that. And I've just gone through very quickly a bit of a checklist of some of the things you might want to consider depending on the sort of presentation that you're doing. So I'm going to share a few tips with you in a moment. Right, okay. So I have 10 top tips for you when you're doing any kind of presentation. And I think these can apply to some kind of public presentation. It could be an internal board meeting. It could be an interview situation. It could just be a conversation with your team. So my top 10 tips are: research your audience. Send out 3 key messages in your presentation. Don't overload it. Be mindful of your body language. Be open, be confident, be comfortable. And take notice of your voice. The way that you deliver what you're saying is really important. And first impressions count. So people will make their minds up about you within maybe 7 seconds. And it's very hard to go back and make a first impression. You know, you're really just getting one chance with that. So having considered who your audience is and what message you're trying to get over, you may want to consider the environment that you're working in. You may want to consider what are you wearing. You're standing at the front talking. If you're talking to a large audience, you're not going to pick out tiny little individual things about them necessarily, but you're one person on the stage, so people can be, picking out very small things about you. So you need to be mindful of that, but not fearful of it. So my last 5 of these top 10 tips are: stay connected with your audience. Make eye contact with them. Share your gaze around the room. Don't just look at one person. Warm up beforehand. Make sure that you're in the right state of mind, both mentally and physically, before you start. So you may want to take a little bit of time out before you start, 10 minutes, 15 minutes of quiet time, so that you can empty your mind of everything other than what you're about to do, and then just get on with your presentation in a confident way. And so know your subject matter. Believe in yourself. That is so important. If you believe in yourself, you'll take your audience with you. And rehearse, practice is really important. So that's quite a lot covered in this webinar so far. I'm just going to check in with my my device for my questions. So questions from the students, let's have a look. How can we stop being afraid of public speaking? Okay, well, this is about the fear that I was talking about at the beginning, and this false evidence appearing real. You will become much more confident and therefore much less fearful if you've followed some of the tips in this webinar. You really can overcome these. There are some very, very good techniques that can be learned and used. The next question is, what if the presentation is too big and there's not enough room for it all? Well, this is where the sequencing comes in. So, you may have to cut some bits out, or maybe you have to do more than one presentation. I certainly can't cover in an hour everything that I know about how to do a presentation, which is why we call this webinar an introduction to presentations. So we may well follow this with more content. So if it's too big and there's not enough room for it, and you don't discover that until you're actually delivering it, then there's a big lesson there, I think. So next time you will actually go through that brainstorming process and the sequencing and working out what needs to stay and what needs to go. The next question is, how much time should be given for answers during the presentation? Well, again, this comes back to the planning stage. So I was tasked with delivering an hour today, and we are 45 minutes in. And I'm now allowing 15 minutes for the questions. So I'm just glancing down at the questions now because they're just coming through. This is very different if you're in a live situation where you're actually in the room with the people asking the questions. You manage actually that quite differently. And sometimes there could be people with their hands up and there can be more questions. So you may have to actually frame that and set the expectation up front. So you might say, and now we have 10 minutes for some questions. Or you might say, I have time for 2 more questions, so that you're framing that all the time and managing the expectation. If there are a lot of questions and there's the opportunity to stay on after the event, maybe you can say, I'll be staying around and having a coffee with you all. So if anyone's got any more questions, please feel free to come up and talk to me. You can possibly manage it that way. It really does depend on the context of the presentation that you're doing. But in terms of how much time you should give, in most of the things that I do, I usually allow 10 to 15 minutes, and that's usually sufficient. What can be very painful is if you've allowed that 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end of your presentation, and you finish your presentation, you say, thank you very much, and then you say, any questions? And you're faced with silence, and there are no questions. Now, there's different ways of handling this. You might choose to say, well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure sharing this information with you today, or however you choose to wrap up that's relevant to what you've been presenting on. And we finished 15 minutes early, so you can all go and enjoy your coffee break or your journey home, or again, depending on the context. Some people would be quite pleased to actually get away early. So it's not a bad thing, but it can feel quite awkward when there are no questions. It could be that you've covered everything, so there are no questions, or it could be that the audience are completely bamboozled and they just don't know what to say. One of the things you can do, and I've done this for people before, and they've actually said to me at the beginning, if nobody asks me a question, will you please ask me one? And they may have even given me a question to ask. So sometimes that's about planting somebody in the room, and that's not a bad thing to do. It could be that it could just be even one of your team who said, you know, now I've heard you deliver that in that way, I actually have a question. So there's ways around it. Let me just go back to the questions. How many slides should I use in my presentation? Again, this will depend on your audience and the subject that you're delivering and how visual you need to make it. I think one of the key things that is important when you are using slides is that you don't just stand there and read them. If they're full of bullet points and that keeps you on track, that's fine. If you're using that as a little bit of a crutch, I don't think there's a problem with that. And so long as you're not reading the slides, no one's going to think bad of you that you're using it as the prompt for your next piece of information. I do think it is really bad when you're just constantly reading every slide that you're putting up, and that's almost insulting to your audience because they're probably capable of reading the slides themselves. Sometimes if it's a quote, I mean, I was reading a quote from the book I referred to at the beginning of this presentation, and I was reading that because they were not actually my words. I was trying to give you information that somebody else had provided. So that's fine to do that. And sometimes if it's very technical, you may read it and then add further explanation. So again, it depends on the context and what message you're trying to get over. Sometimes a presentation is just better without any slides. You know, we've probably all heard the expression death by PowerPoint. It can become very tedious. But I think the other thing is to make your slides very interesting. And in some of the presentations that I do, my slides are purely visual. They're just pictures and there's no words. And then I'm talking around those pictures. And again, that helps meet different people's learning styles because some people are more visual. Some people, so they want to see things. Some people are more auditory, so they want to hear things. Again, that's about knowing your audience. Can I use any specific terms in my presentation if very few people know about them? Okay, can I use any specific terms in my presentation if very few people know about them? Good question, actually, because sometimes if you're in a technical presentation or in a very specific industry, people can use a lot of jargon and a lot of acronyms. Now, if everybody in the room knows what they are, that's fine if you absolutely know that they know that. But if you're using material that people aren't going to understand, you're going to lose your audience. I'm trying to think of an acronym that would make sense to everybody here. Turn my volume off. Okay. I can't think of anything off the top of my head right now. Okay, I'm working with some students at Nottingham Trent University at the moment on something called the IOD £10 challenge. Now, I wouldn't expect for one moment for anybody watching this to understand what the IOD is. It actually stands for the Institute of Directors. So that's a very typical example of an acronym. So IOD is the Institute of Directors. But if you don't know that, you could miss the next few sentences that I say because you're thinking, well, what does IOD stand for? And even if you work in a specific industry where these acronyms are used all the time, sometimes when we're concentrating on a presentation, we forget for a moment what 3 letters stand for. So it's worth actually checking in with yourself and explaining what the acronym is. So once I've explained that the IOD is the Institute of Directors, and maybe I've said the Institute of Directors a couple of times, I can then revert to saying IOD and I'll still have people with me. I mean, you'll have your own example of those acronyms. And it's the same if you're delivering really technical information. You need to qualify the understanding. So maybe you ask a question and get a response to check that people are actually understanding that level of technicality. And I think we have one last question here. What if the presentation has a long name? Well, that is an interesting question. I'm not really quite sure what you mean by that. A long name and you can't fit it onto a slide, or a long name because it's a lot to say. I can't answer that because I don't fully understand what the question means. Maybe someone's going to send me another question to qualify that, and then I can answer it. Now, the question now is, what do I do in this few moments whilst I'm waiting to see whether that question comes through? Now, I can either... This is difficult because obviously I'm doing this remotely. I'm not in the room with you, so I can't see what's going on. I don't know if somebody's frantically typing me a question or not. So I am starting to waffle. And if you start to waffle, then you're going to lose your audience. So hopefully, by waffling and not knowing the answer to that question and waiting to see whether I'm going to get that question qualified a little, then you're seeing a real live example of what waffling and not knowing what to say means. Now, I think that is actually really useful, and it's a really good learning point. And I think you can all take something away from this as to how you may deal with that if it happens to you again, or if it happens to you for a first time. So I am frantically checking away on my other device here, and I can't see. No, I'm not getting any more questions through. So I'll just go back to that very first question. How can we stop being afraid when speaking in public? Know your audience, know your subject, rehearse it well, practice, practice, practice. And when you're comfortable practicing with yourself, find somebody to practice with so you can get some honest feedback. Even if it's feedback that you don't really like, it's better to get it from one person that you know, like, and trust than get it from a whole room full, which is pretty unlikely to happen, to be fair. So practice is the key, and get the support that you need to improve and learn techniques that will help support you. So whether that is maybe I don't know what you have in Moscow, but certainly over here we have speaking groups where you can go and actually practice in front of an audience and get that feedback and learn. So if there's groups like that, you can join speaking societies, presentation societies, and there's some really, really good NLP techniques that can help you get over your fear of public speaking. So they're worth some research, and maybe they're a subject for us to cover on another webinar. So with no more questions coming through, we're finishing about 6 minutes under the hour. So I'm going to let you take an early break. I'm going to wish you a very good day. I hope you found this information useful, and I wish you every success in your next presentation. And remember, your next presentation is just the first presentation. There'll always be another on another day, and you will improve and you will get more confident and you will be successful in all that you do. So that's a goodbye from me. I've been Deborah Labbate, and it's been a pleasure spending time with you today. Thank you very much.